May I have your attention again? You can continue to eat. The checks will be given to you for payment later. This has been quite an extraordinary event for me, too, because I've heard what's happening in the last few years when I haven't been part of it intimately, and it's breathtaking. And I think those of you who are interested in climate change, however, and I think it was touched on by Mr. Festa, that it's a tough thing because it's one thing to convince someone perhaps to use a condom or something of that sort. When you're talking about climate change, about 12 years ago, I had a soap summit devoted to climate change for the American soap opera people, trying to get them to tune in on it. And by the way, one of the best guests that day was a vice admiral in the Navy. And it turns out that the military got the message a lot earlier than anybody else, because suddenly they were going to have a melting ice cap, and that's going to turn into an ocean, and that they're going to have to patrol. And there are going to be a lot of refugees going and flooding back and forth. That's going to be something they're going to have to deal with. So even then, they knew about it. So just as a hint, any of you want to get an ally, I think you might want to check on them. Okay. This was a splendid panel. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I learned a lot. I thought I knew a lot. Nada. I learned a lot. Now we want you to help us learn more. We want you to share what your concerns are or your contributions to what's been said. And don't be shy about it. Raise your hand, and we'll get started talking. And you can address it at one person. Anybody else up here who wants to comment after that person is finished is free. I want it to be a discussion. I want it to be a schmooze, if you will. So anybody got any question they would like to ask anybody on the yes, hand raised, sir. Speak up loudly if you. Oh, wait a minute. We have a mic. We have a mic.
Thank you very much for this. This is actually a very enlightening panel or series of talks. I wanted to start with a comment and a question. My comment is following up on the last presentation. My perception has been that when people climate deniers or just people who are against the use of the word climate or various climate change link directly climate science with the climate solutions. So for whatever reason, whether it's activists scientists who are activists, or I don't know necessarily the historical background, but they link the fact that we're talking about climate change with the solutions that have been proposed mostly from liberals. And that's why I feel like you get this dichotomy. So the question is, one question is, how can we disentangle these two? How can we show people that there's climate change and there's a climate science on one hand telling us what the problem is, and there's a consensus for that, but there's no consensus on what we should do about it. That's where you have a lot of the different opinions from party lines, from religious views and whatnot. So I think that's an important thing that we need to be able to disentangle the climate science from the climate change solutions. And so my question was specifically, given that we talked a lot about we saw a lot about changing behavior regarding contraception, which is also or has been a very polarizing topic, especially in deeply religious communities. I see a lot of parallels in that sense with climate change. Where
okay, we'd like to get an answer.
Yeah, sorry. So that's the question.
Who wants to tackle it? Anybody on the panel?
Well, I'll take a quick stab. So one of the things that we found to really work in that is to actually not try to talk about climate science. Not try to get into that. We say, what problem are you trying to solve today? And it turns out that, of course, a lot of the problems are driven by climate. But we don't ask them to say, oh, and by the way, you're right, climate change is a problem. What we say is, what problem are you trying to solve? So in coastal Louisiana, it was land loss. Some of our farmers in the Midwest, it's the changing extremes of precipitation. So longer droughts, deeper deluges. So their problem is soil health. How do I get more water stored in the soil? Where there's a bunch of practices that you have to adopt to do that. And when you do that, you actually begin to increase the carbon storage in the soil. And that is incredibly important in the overall solution. The Paris Agreement to keep the climate from changing more than 2 degrees. When you dig into it and you look at the numbers, how do they expect to get to that outcome? Only about a third of that comes from actually reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, a good majority of that comes from carbon being stored in the ground, carbon being stored in trees, various other ways of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. Well, you can have a perfectly fine conversation with a farmer or a rancher or timber operator around those kinds of things based on what problem are they trying to solve. Here in California, trying to solve the problem of fire. Well, there's ways that we can start doing that actually really begin to benefit. And then it's a very short step for even the most conservative of folks to begin to say, well, you know what? Let's say I'm a farmer. If I could get an extra $1 per acre for these practices because somebody wants to pay me for carbon sequestration, I'm okay with that. So it really begins to, in Illinois, I'll give you one more example. The state of Illinois, they're looking at their energy future going forward. They have a Republican governor, and last year they designed and approved a plan that preserves nuclear in their portfolio, gives them more stability, keeps their prices down, and by the way, will result in less CO2 coming out of Illinois than would have existed, than would have been allowed under Obama's Clean Power Plan. So that was coming in and saying, we need to do this because we have to solve climate change. They're like, no, we need a durable, we need to be able to tell companies, move to Illinois, we've got a long-term plan for providing our power. So I think part of the solution is not saying, you know what, I'm not going to try to win that argument with you. But let's talk about what your problem is today and how we can work together. And then as you begin to go down paths, you say, well, if you did it this way, it'd also help with climate change. You might not believe in it, but it'll help other people, either support us or there's grants available, et cetera. And that may be a path.
In order to get successful change, you have to, there are two things you have to do. One, you have to bring the future into the present. And secondly, you have to personalize it, namely, what kind of changes are affecting your life, and then how do you begin to change it? And I think you're doing a beautiful job in personalizing it. And,
I was just going to comment that if my cardiologist tells me to go to the gym, or if Jane Fonda calls me and invites me to go to the gym with her, the result may be different. And so it doesn't matter whether I'm an expert on cardiology as long as I go to the gym. The weakness of An Inconvenient Truth and An Inconvenient Sequel is the idea is make them into climatologists, give them expertise on the melting Greenland ice cap, and hopefully that'll lead to something. But in fact, it doesn't matter if people even have a clue about climate science. If people give up eating meat because it's better for their health, do we care that it's that reason as opposed to trying to reduce their carbon footprint? So I think the key thing in research, which we do a lot of, is to understand what actually motivates each behavior change among this demographic. And if it's Jane Fonda calling them, then let's get her on the phone. If it's something else, do that, but don't try to just turn them all into climatologists because you're just beating your head against a wall.
And I just want to piggyback on what everyone's saying too, and going back to what I was saying about using universal storylines. And this is what will reach across party lines, is the themes that we can all relate to. Dr. Bandura showed those clips of those amazing young people who are doing their part for climate change, and she said she mentioned despair and sadness. And David, the Louisiana Project, there was mentions of home. Those are all larger themes that we all kind of can connect to. And I feel like the more we can attach these issues to these universal themes that also, have emotional ties, where we're affecting hearts and minds, that, we're able to then address these issues.
Mm-hmm. Let me raise a point about climate change. One of the factors that you started with, we started with, was the book that was written in 1968 about the explosion of population. When I was born, listen to this. When I was born, the year I was born, and you can go back and look at the number and figure out what year I was born after this, the total world population was 1,900,000,000. Today it's 7,500,000,000.
Yep.
Around that. And by the time I die, it'll be 8 billion. Okay, I'm scheduled to do that. But what I'm saying is, in my lifetime, the total population of the world has quadrupled. It used to take a long time to go up from 1 million to 2 million. Then it took 100 years to go up, to 3 million. Now it takes 12 years or less. Now, if we're going to talk about population, two good things about this point I'm making. If you go back to what we were talking about, the use of condoms and the family size of family. One of the things in Brazil, the outcome of the telenovelas and the storylines in those, the Sao Paulo University people studied why that happened, and they gave an enormous amount of credit to the soap operas, and it brought it down from the high 3s, early 4s, down to the low 2s. That's a very interesting way to approach climate change, and I just want to rate it. Does that make sense? Anybody want to comment on that? No. Okay. So next question.
You have two
Could I
comments.
say, I will say one thing on that. That is a topic when you work for an environmental organization, that topic comes up all the time. And it's one that we as a community, as an environmental community, have been very reluctant to get engaged in because of the controversy around it. And whether or not that's the right call, I don't know. But it is something that it's like one of the big unspoken things that we don't.
And by the way, people who are in business like PCI, the initials stood for Population Communications International. Now they call themselves something impact or something like
PCI,
that.
media impact.
Media impact. There has been a steering away from that issue on the part of a lot of those organizations that used to be concerned about it. I just think the other good thing about doing it through that medium is that it becomes intensely personal. You've heard about the effectiveness of getting people to use, condoms or diaphragms or whatever. That's a part, and boy, is that a better way, not better way, I shouldn't say that, an easier way to deal with emotional and outcomes that an individual can feel that they can probably attain. The biggest problem I foresee in trying to do climate change through our system of the way we're doing it is that self-efficacy, the ability to have power to do something, it seems to me it's so distant in the minds of most people. And what you're going to tell them to do or suggest they can do as one person watching one show, you don't talk to them as a collective. You talk to them as person by person when you're doing television series. And you have to do that so emotionally to change their behavior. Now, I can see changing behavior on the level I'm talking about. Changing the level of behavior on something so vast, and you've touched on trying to do it, in your thing. But that's the problem. The problem is how do you make that emotional connection and the sense of self-efficacy, which stems from Professor Bandura, to make that happen. Okay, enough of my editorial. Next question.
Hey there, this is for Kathy and William. I was taken aback. I know Maurizio, by the way, and I know his wife runs an NGO, and so he was uniquely positioned to do the nonprofit, for-profit model with East Lifts High. I'm curious, first question is, if you can unpack for us, why Hulu didn't pick up another season? If there's anything you can share in the budget, I'm curious. And then for William, I'm curious about how we could structure these nonprofit, for-profit endeavors to go, making this stuff costs a huge amount of money. I made a movie that cost $28 million. It was managing a $28 million asset for under 2 years, right? And it came in on time and under budget, but that's a huge, right? These aren't cheap things that serial narratives are very expensive to make, even at the day-to-day level. So I'm just curious as to your experience with getting the money from all these nonprofits and how that worked.
I'll comment quickly on Hulu. I think there were two things. I think one of them was purely political. Islas High was brought in under a regime that has since turned over. And so we were no longer part of the new regime at Hulu, and I think that was one reason. And there's another reason that I think people are afraid to say, and that's because we were a show with people of color. We call it the Rosita Parks syndrome, where, you know, we kept getting pushed into the Latino box. You know, every time we had meetings with marketing, it was like, we have great interviews set up for you at you know, People Latino and Latina Magazine, which is great. But our viewers were actually only 40% Latino. 60% were Asian, African American, Caucasian. And again, this is where I'm talking about the power of those universal storylines. It's like it crossed all lines, this show, but kept, because of the all Latino cast, because we were all brown, it kept getting put in that box. And unfortunately, it just couldn't stand against this J.J. Abrams show that Hulu was doing, the Stephen King show that Hulu was doing, The Handmaid's Tale. And so that's a unique challenge that we're up against. We pitched recently a show with an all-black cast, and we were turned down. And one of the reasons was, well, we already have a black show. Which is just unbelievable, you know, that we're still up against that in the system. And so,
Bill?
yeah.
The cost of season 1, which was produced by PMC directly, and Katie Elmore Mota then spun off and set up Wise for season 2 and beyond. We did totally on spec, 24 half-hour episodes of television. Now, some people in Hollywood are spending $1 million an episode. We did not. We did this really on the cheap. We had a tremendous commitment from the writers and the actors. The actors did it non-union, then it went to union after that. But, you know, at first we said, this is going to end up on the PMC website. Nobody's going to want it, until we saw the quality of the product. So what would you guess we spent on 24 half-hour episodes? It's under $4 million. So
Which is really hard to do.
it's really hard to do. And it would cost more now.
Burn everybody out.
Yeah, okay. But the point is, we have, as a nonprofit organization, donors who are absolutely committed to making this possible. So in fact, I mentioned the new show we're working on. We're actually working on 3 new shows. And we have the finances to get these shows to the point that they're in front of networks. Now, whether we'll have to spend and produce what we did with East Los High or do something short of that will depend on how well these are written and how well the agent deals with them and all of that. And clearly, we were very lucky with East Los High. Number one, we had great talent, and they produced a really fabulous show that's become a role model for entertainment education in a U.S. context. But clearly the other issue is networks like Hulu and Netflix and CBS want to know, are we going to make money with this? And they're all scared. So there can be a revenue, or rather a cost-sharing strategy. So with Televisa in Mexico, we actually are footing part of the cost of a new telenovela that's being produced in Mexico, and Televisa is footing the rest of it. And so that's making it easier for them, and the show is going to deal with, guess what, teen pregnancy. So our mission is being accomplished, and their mission is being accomplished. They're getting subsidy for what they expect will be a profitable show. The other thing that's stopping networks is fear of controversy. We're dealing with family planning, abortion, or climate change. People are afraid of getting people angry. And in fact, what's been really amazing is because of the way Sabido designed the methodology that we're using, we've had 0 controversy in any country on all of these hot button issues, including an abortion on East Los High and gay relationships on East Los High and family planning in the conservative Islamic part of northern Nigeria and stopping FGM and a whole bunch of other issues, zero controversy because nobody's telling the audience what to do. Whereas the climate advocates and the health advocates are saying, do this, don't do that. You need to clean up your act. You need to listen to Bernie Sanders. And people don't want to be lectured to. But if they're learning from somebody they're in love with by seeing their mistakes and seeing their successes, they'll do it on their own. And that's really where this modeling is so powerful, and it doesn't create backlash.
Can I just say one thing on that, and that hunger to connect? I think where we've gotten in this country, particularly in the redder parts of the country, is that there's actual pain about being disassociated from your environmental values. One of the farmers that we feature in Rancher Farmer Fisherman was so concerned about coming out as being calling himself a conservationist, that it took a long months of conversations with him, and finally he had to go and sequester himself with his pastor, and they prayed for days and nights about should he do this, and he finally decided yes. And then when we made the documentary, he was very nervous about that. He said, well, more people are going to see the documentary. And we said, well, what we want to do is we want to take the documentary to these little town halls in rural America and start showing it. And what happened was, Justin is the farmer's name. Justin is such the salt of the earth. He's so archetypal. He is all of these people up and down the Corn Belt. And they saw themselves in him. And I had grown men cry at the screening. I mean, they're like, that's finally somebody, this is how I want to connect. This is what I want. But finding that ability to make those stories personal and then connect and realize that they're not alone. And this is not, they don't have to vote for Hillary Clinton, But, I think you're really, I mean, what you guys have been saying, I think there is a real thirst out there for something that helps connect them like that.
Yes. Anybody else?
Hi. So I have a question. So this question is for both Dr. Bandura and for Kathy, and a little bit complex. Bear with me. I noted that some examples that didn't come up, obviously because you folks didn't work on these shows, but that have been credited for changing belief systems are Will and Grace for the gay and lesbian movement and acceptance of gays and lesbians, and also now Trans America for trans. And I heard the head of Amazon Episodic say, we didn't set out to make an issue show, but we did because of the plot and the story and people got into it. The first part of the question for Dr. Bandura is, is this the correct definition to think about changing belief systems instead of behaviors necessarily with climate change? Is there anything useful there, or is that more difficult to change people's belief systems than to get people to do a simple behavior differently or one action? And the second piece then for Kathy is, having worked on a show where they're seemingly simple actions, but you've woven that in over the course of time, like how long does it take to like seamlessly get a personal action in there? And do you think it would be harder or easier with, changing a belief system and an attitude toward, an entire topic of thinking?
Well, we've had a lot of research in changing attitudes and beliefs. The problem is they don't help you much in changing behavior. And so now, Miguel Sabido, in his first serial, the Archbishop said that they would oppose it. And then, so what Miguel realized, you have to set up a value grid in which you see, the problem is that we get stuck on things like, the issues that come up at the abstract level, and people have a lot of garbage that they include in the abstract, and what you need to do is get it down to a concrete level. So what Miguel did, he went to the Archbishop and he said, well, let me describe what this program will promote. It will promote educating girls. It will reduce the macho lifestyle in marriage. It will, and so what he did is just described a lot of changes that are at the concrete level. The Archbishop, and then he said, these are the consequences if you don't do anything about it. Girls are not going to get educated. There's going to be a lot of macho problems in families and so on. The Archbishop looked at this and he said, I agree with all of this. In addition, I'm going to send priests for epilogues in which they would explain how they should try to raise the size of the family in terms of what they can support. And so in creating a serial drama, it's important that you create it and present it in concrete terms so that people will understand what kind of changes are being promoted, and then you cut through all the abstractness that is the impediment to change.
Thank you for your question. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because if East Los High had the HIV episode, it would not have been as effective as it was when in season 1 we grew to grow and love the antagonist, Vanessa, and see the decisions that she made that helped her contract HIV, and then see the emotional turmoil it caused and all the new choices she had to make and the consequences. And that happened over the course of a season. And that was paramount. And that's why we weave it into, because you have to take your audience for the journey. You have to take your audience for the journey, not only to see all the decision making, but also so that your viewer is learning more about the character, and again, seeing themselves in them, identifying with them, and you're going to see much more change there. I think you're completely right. Transparent isn't about. Amazon didn't pick up Transparent because it was about a trans, woman. It's because that show's about family. And Will and Grace isn't about a gay man. It's about friendship, right? And so being able to, again, use those themes and over the long term and bringing your audience along with that journey is much more effective than the HIV episode.
Bill?
I think it's easier to change behavior than it is to change attitudes. And I think the attitudes often follow the behavior. So hitting your head against a wall trying to educate people and change their attitude and their knowledge of some issue is much more difficult than changing their behavior through role modeling and through changing perception of what is normal. So, for example, say you arrived a little late to this conference, and it happened to be March 17th, and everybody except you was wearing green clothing. And you walked in, you'd go, oh, I didn't get the memo, oops, and you'd feel very self-conscious. And the next time you were going to come to such an event, if it was on March 17th, you'd wear green clothing. But there's nothing in your attitude that says, I should wear green clothing, and probably you could have an argument with somebody for months and never agree that green clothing has any benefit. So the fact that it's suddenly a norm somewhere is much more influential. The first and only paper I remember from freshman psychology was a paper by Harvard psychologist Solomon Asch, who studied conformism. And he would draw lines of different length on the blackboard and have a room with a number of people like this state which line was longer. So imagine he would say, okay, we're doing a study in visual perception. From where you're sitting, which looks taller, the phone or the glass? And everybody, because they'd all been secretly told to lie, except for one, said the glass, sir. And then he got to the poor, uninformed subject. And that uninformed subject named the glass almost every time. So fitting in is far more important than telling the truth. And when you understand that, you realize to change norms, the first thing you have to do is change the perception of what is normal.
Great panel. Maybe two quick questions. One, and I think Mike touched. Thank you. One of my touchstones for environmental change is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I know it's a different thing, but I'm trying to triangulate and understand the difference between sort of the behavior change, the sort of narrative, sort of soft narrative approach versus that sort of, definitely I would say we'd probably agree was impactful and did change attitudes. So I'm wondering, as a compare and contrast between, say, when I was growing up, Jacques Cousteau or Rachel Carson, that's what got me into environmental issues, not this. And so I'd be interested in that thing. And the other thing is, I recognize a wonderful work you've done. I'm so honored to actually be listening to you. But
Thank you.
you know, there's a substrate of knowledge or truth, right? And so if we're just working at the behavior change, sort of like this sort of like modeling and, you know, people are observing people around them, is there a danger that there's like a less of an anchor, a weight behind it? Like, in other words, we're in a I hate to use this phrase, post-truth, post-fact world. So when we're talking about attitude changes and understanding things, maybe it isn't important, but then also wonder, where's the anchor point when people are having discussions? Where's the weight that's going to have people sort of justify their behaviors as opposed to just modeling? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Let me address the second part first. We think of fake news as being hugely influential, and it is. And Dr. Bandura has studied the effects of violence on television on behavior, which is horrifying. But the role of radio in the genocide in Rwanda is undisputed. People were urged over the radio to kill the Tutsis, and they killed 1 million of them. And so very clearly, negative programming can be done intentionally or unintentionally and have negative effects. And it's very important to understand that negative role modeling is very dangerous for societal well-being and individual well-being. So one of the benefits for us in developing countries is government programming is still dominant, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and they don't let anything on the air that's counter to government policy. So as long as the policies are decent, you don't have people modeling schoolroom shoot-ups or whatever the negative behavior might be that somebody thinks would attract an audience. And so it's designed, as broadcasting originally was intended, to educate the masses. And back to the first question of books, people did used to read books, but now the media has changed people's attention span to a point that something longer than a half hour, and in some people something longer than 7 minutes, is really hard to get away with. So you have to design the intervention given the media consumption patterns of your target audience. In Ethiopia, the new medium is radio, because only 6% have TV. But here, it's a very different story. And so, yes, you can put out a book and influence people, but certainly if you want to influence the broad majority of the American public, you've got to do more than put out books.
Now, consider the young voices. It's not an issue of attitudes, values, or behavior. What they're saying is we have to take control of our future. And so, you see, it's not a question of global warming or anything. They are now concerned that the adults are irresponsible and that they're going to have to take control over it. And the one girl says, if they can do it, I should be able to do it. So not so much an issue of attitudes, values, or behavior, but the modeling reflects concerns you have about your lifestyle, the concerns you have of where your life is going, and to what extent can you be an agent of change. And so I think it's better to construe it in terms of what are people's value commitments, what is it that how do they want to improve their lives, and how can the guided mastery and the modeling help them to get there.
Just on the Rachel Carson point, so we've got plenty of information. I mean, there's, believe me, we have no problem with data. That's not the issue. I think one of the important differences is when Dr. Carson wrote her book, we were in an era where it was still a very technocratic society. The goal was to stop bad things from happening, and there was a sense that was best accomplished top down. People looked to their government to stop bad things from happening. My own organization started with the ban on DDT, stop this bad thing from happening. Where we are today is it needs to be bottom up. It's changing how communities relate to a source of their own identity and their own wealth. And these are decisions that actually have to come from the bottom up and then reinforced from the top down. So it's a much more complex environment that we're working in. And just again, another little illustration from Farming America. When we first started working with farmers on a particular conservation practice, we got one guy to agree to try it on a strip right next to the road by his house. And one of the consequences of this practice is it makes your fields look messy. And we started working with him because he's one of these, you will know the term, I can't remember it. You're the people that everybody follows, one of the big influencers. So he says, okay, I'll try it. The cultural norm for clean fields was so strong that the first day of plowing, everybody goes out and plows. He's plowing back here, but no one can see that because he's got a dirty field in front of the road. That night, he gets a knock on the door, and it's the neighbors. His wife answers, and they say, "Hey, what hospital's Bob in? And has he made arrangements?" There's absolutely no other explanation for why a farmer as good as Bob would have a field that looked as crap as this thing does. So that's, and imagine the social bravery it took for him to do that. Now, it worked in that community. This is a practice called no-till. Some of you may have heard of it. It's actually
conservation agriculture.
Exactly. Very much on the upswing. But 10 years ago, you had to find somebody who was willing to have that kind of social bravery.
So I've got a question for pretty much the whole panel. I think what you did back then, Sonny, with the soap summits is a brilliant idea, and I think we should follow in your footsteps to some degree as the next generation, because what I've realized in the social change sector of entertainment is that it's incredibly fragmented. I talked, for example, to Bill a few months ago, and I said, who from participant media has reached out to you? Because, in this space, participant media is the one company that controls massive amounts of capital and has a lot of individual decision-making they can do. And Bill said, just some lower-ranked people, which is crazy to me because the people at participant media must be aware of what PMC is doing. And when I went down to Mexico a few weeks ago and met with Miguel Sabido, I asked him who from participant media has reached out to him, and he said, "Who is participant media?" And one of our sort of parts of our mission statement is to bring together this space and to stop the fragmentation. But we can't do it by ourselves, obviously. All that we did was basically organize a lot of the different organizations involved into a big ecosystem where you have one big website where you can see most people that are doing something, and I'm sure that we still miss some. But I think back to the SOAP Summit that you had back then, Sonny, this is a very powerful thing to do this sort of conspiracy where you bring all these important players together, kind of like a summit like today. And Deborah, thank you so much for organizing this. It's a really incredible experience to see both Bill and Al together on stage, who we saw separately before. But I think what we need to do in this space is really bring people together and share what we're doing. I was sitting with Emily outside for an hour, and we're talking to each other about what we were doing individually. And in most spaces, like the film space when it started in, say, 1895, was all about people like Edison either sharing what they're doing or not sharing what they're doing. And depending on how much it was shared and how much cooperation there was between the different players, the space would either expand or contract. And so, Sonny, do you have advice, and this is actually for the whole panel, do you have advice for, say, the next generation of media makers or the people in the room, how to best cooperate with each other and how to make the next sort of SOAP summit actually happen on a larger scale?
You're looking at me, right? I don't know how to answer that question because the industry has changed so much. I mean, when we did this, there were 3 networks. And all the soaps were on those 3 networks. So if I could get those people to cooperate and be there, we had it. Now, as you know from hearing the panel, it's all over the place, and it's a great time to be in television or want to be in television or want to be creative or want to sell a script. There are so many more markets now and so many more opportunities out there. But it also divides up the audience. The ratings we get now for the top shows on the networks are minuscule compared to what they used to get. And yet they still can make money at it, but it's been a trial because the market has been dissipated and fragmented. And that's good if you're creative and you want to get something on like in Hulu. It would have been very, very difficult, if not impossible, for PCI and for those people who did it to really get on a network with that kind of show. As a matter of fact, when the concept was first started and they went into production, they didn't know whether they were going to do 6-minute segments or half-hour shows. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yeah, you knew that, yeah. And it wasn't until Hulu came around that they knew they had to edit for half-hour shows. But they were prepared to do serials, 6 minutes at a time to get it on the air somewhere.
Like YouTube.
And that's how special the new markets are, and that's a great opportunity. But remember, it also fragments your audience in terms of who you're going to be reaching. So I don't know how else to comment on what your question was.
I can add one thing to that. The more complex the media market, the more an opportunity for something like Hollywood Health and Society. Sonny talked about the origin of it and CDC's getting involved in setting up an office in Hollywood to both advise script writers and producers on health issues so they could get it right if the hospital show is going to deal with a particular issue, and to give awards to the best treatments of health issues in an awards ceremony once a year, which they've done, and I think effectively. But the same model could be used with a lot of issues. The Environmental Media Association was set up to both provide technical advice and provide awards to entertainment shows for treatment of environmental issues. But the word environment is a very broad word, and one could set up even within that, just on climate or on some other issue, an awards program. And if people are going to incorporate scripts and storylines to address an issue, even if their motivation is to get recognized with a big fancy awards program and get a prize, it still could do a lot of good and could influence, what do we have now, 500 channels. It could influence people across those channels in addition to working with people who are going to do Sabito-style programs on one of those channels.
Hollywood Health and Society actually is now doing climate change too as one of their issues.
Mm-hmm.
And when you organize this, I'm ready for an invitation.
I want to say that we have about 5 minutes more for questions, and then I would like somebody, I think I'm right, that Deborah's ill. Is there someone who wants to come up and wrap up for your group? If so, I want to leave a few minutes for that. What?
We'll figure it out. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to save 10 minutes for that. Your question.
I've spent my beginning of my career in entertainment, and I've spent the second half of my career in interactive entertainment and technology. So my question comes as a marketer when I hear each one of you say some things that I'm just, Sonny, you said it's not specific, so it's going to be harder to address. right? So I'm hearing that. I'm hearing Bill talk about teen pregnancy, so we've got a target audience of teens. East Los High, we know who the target audience is for that, who's watching that program. High schoolers or aspirational. And then I heard David talked about Justin, who is a farmer. So that's a show going after the farmer. So I've got two-part question. One is, who is the influencer segment that we would want to go after for this serial drama, right? And I think we would want to, I mean, this is my point of view, because it's so big, when we talk about climate change, who's the one, should we go after somebody instead of everybody? And then two, who would be that audience that we'd want to go after? Who is that influencer audience?
I think you have to go after multiple audiences through multiple shows. Climate change and...
We want to get one thing done, at
understood.
least.
But behavior change related to climate can be one of 1,000 different behaviors. You can give up meat, you can drive a hybrid, you can insulate your house, you can change the light bulbs, you can put up solar panels, you can have one less baby, you can do a lot of different things. You know, the Rotary put out a thing, the 22 things you can do to stop climate change. Well, there's probably 1,000 things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. One show that tries to address all of those different things to all different audiences is going to be pretty obvious to the audience. Oh, that's the climate change soap opera. And they're not going to want to watch it. So I think what you've got to do instead is make a very detailed list of all the behaviors we want to change that relate to climate. And more broadly, you know, biodiversity preservation, which is a climate issue, and all the other issues, plastics pollution, and then figure out, okay, how do we address that issue to the audience that is most in need of it? And I think we're going to talk about many, many shows, not one.
Before anybody else hits, I am going to ask you a question. I'll put you in a bad spot maybe, but I'm going to ask you a question.
It won't be the first time.
You started out in population communications.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Population Institute before.
And Population Institute. So you were very much involved in population. Yes. Now I don't hear you talking about that at all anymore. Have you dismissed that as an entry level into how to deal, or a part of the issues in dealing, not in this country particularly, but around because you do shows all over the world. In that, or is that still a part of your subject matter?
Well, actually, I did mention it in my talk, and the importance of population as a factor in climate change. We do address population and family size and fertility rate and age of marriage and age of childbearing and all of those issues that affect population very directly in our shows. But we also know that people don't make family size decisions based on global demographic trends.
I understand.
We're not trying to educate the audience to be demographers, but we are trying to educate the audience on the benefits of waiting until adulthood, on the benefits of spacing childbearing, on the benefits of smaller family norms, on the use of family planning and its safety and effectiveness. So it's very much focused on population and other sustainability issues.
I can say from my point of view, one of the audiences that I think a lot about are everybody in the red parts of the country. And of course that includes here in California, where the Central Valley is, you know, a red part of the country, and really helping to create safe space for them to recognize themselves and be celebrated as conservationists and environmentalists. And I think, you know, farms are the source of all kinds of universal stories about families, about generations, about business, about the environment, about being buffeted by change, by global forces bigger than you are. Immigration. How do you deal with my workers who, they're like family, but yet they're also caught up in all those other, I mean, it's an incredible. But the more time I spend with farmers and ranchers, the more universal their stories are, and the more I think there's a real conservation story and a real way to begin to tell about bring the future into the present The other thing is that I think helping people from urban areas really understand a lot more about what life is actually like on a farm or a ranch, and get beyond sort of the simplistic solutions. Some of this farmer I was talking about, Justin, he would be your post. If I told you what he does, how big his farm is, what chemicals he uses, you would say, oh, factory farmer owned by Monsanto. When you read or see the documentary, you're in love with him. You want to be, and you value what he's doing so much. So really breaking down that urban-rural divide over climate change and over environment. So that's something that I mean, I'm sure there's tons of other audiences and decision makers and things like that, but that's just that's an audience that I think about a lot.
So we now have to sort of wrap this up, and I want to tell you how wonderful it is for us up here, and especially, I'll talk for me also, is that I was warned
Sonny,
that nobody would.
can we have one more question and then a wrap-up of next steps?
And that's what I was going to do
Oh,
now.
okay, I apologize. I thought you were doing the final wrap-up.
I
So-
was doing the wrap-up. You want one
Okay.
more question?
We have one more question, very pressing, and then
Okay.
then I'd like to talk about what next steps folks would see, and then we would
I
love
was
to.
going to invite you up here, but okay, go ahead.
And I'm coordinating an entertainment education and climate program. We've been working at it for about 2 years, and it's an urgent topic. So what I'm wondering from the panel is, how fast can we move this into production?
And let me, yeah. Let me piggyback onto that of, so maybe when folks answer, just in the interest of time, we can maybe bundle the answers. So I wanted to talk about what can non-media institutions like Stanford and NGOs, et cetera, what can we do to help facilitate this in collaboration with the media institutions, et cetera? And then also, what would the panel or the audience, what would anybody like to see as next steps? What do we feel is most urgent for next steps? So I think it's kind of a package.
How quickly can we get this into production? That's a tough one. You know, I mean, East Hills High got canceled, right? I mean, we're just up against a lot of different factors. We're up to the whims of the networks. One year they want mermaid shows. One year they want vampire shows. You know, like, and it's really hard, and especially now with Peak TV, there's 497 scripted dramas out right now. You know, we're up against all of that too. So that I wish that we could speed this up. And I think to answer your second question, to pick up on what Toby had suggested, is, you know, I would love to see more events where you can bring content makers, producers, writers together with people like David, who can share stories and the science, but in a compelling way. And you know what Hollywood Health and Society is doing, informing writers. I think we should continue that.
I want to talk about health and society for a moment, because that's a model. There's a university, University of California, which is USC, which has been in the forefront of working with writers and producers in LA. And we have a board of directors, and we meet. I've resigned from that, but I was on that. And we always try to figure out how to do better. And the heads of the networks would come and be on that board with us, so we could figure out how better to respond to the needs of the community, the writers and producers and directors. That's a good model. And you have enough expertise on this, in this room and on this campus to really be a source that is made available as needed by those who are in this idea, have this idea of wanting to do something about it. It isn't that research will run the show. It's research will inform the script, and we'll then give them a better chance to do the right thing. So you might want to think about studying the model of how the Annenberg School has set up Norman Lear Center, how they work with writers and producers and directors, and how they're available. What they really do is they identify the expertise that you need. So you don't have to go out and find it. You call them up, say, this is what we want, and then you were there, so if I'm saying it wrong, let me know. that then they will get you the right expertise, either on site or by phone or whatever you need. So it seems to me, that's one thing that a university like this one is in a really great way to help.
Well, and I think the key is what Hollywood Health and Society does, what we do at Wise Entertainment with how we approach research too. It's showing these creators what we can't slap white papers in front of them. We can't throw statistics like, great, okay, and this, I used to work at Hollywood Health and Society, and, my job was to call writers and producers. If I said, hi, I'm from the CDC, and I want to talk to you about heart disease, click. I can't tell you how many, but if but my job was to share, I have an amazing story about this guy, and then doors started opening. I've sat in so many writers' rooms because we're able to use the research in a way that's palatable for creators. We're looking, as a producer, I'm always looking for drama, I'm looking for conflict, I'm looking for emotion, I'm looking for, those stories that we all relate to. And so if you can digest the research that way, when you get these two together, I think you're going to get much more traction.
I think there's another role Stanford can play. Stanford is a renowned institution, and it can attract serious investment much more than a lot of other entities. And by partnering with people who are in the entertainment industry and willing to try to do some good on some aspects of this issue, Stanford could, I think, really attract a lot of resources to go into positive entertainment media that has a goal of making money but simultaneously of doing a whole lot of good, and become a role model for Hollywood that, in fact, you can have positive programming and have a top show on the air. That was part of our goal of creating East Los High. You don't have to use sex and violence as a way to get ratings. But Stanford could do something specifically on working with groups that want to do shows to model certain behaviors for the American public or some segment of it, and play a role both in bringing resources to it and expertise.
I was invited by the BBC some decade or two ago to go to India and work, and they flew me out there. They wanted to get the Indian television community to pay attention. And we sat around the table with the leaders of the Indian television community. And they said, well, how do we do this? I said, well, the one thing creative talents are addicted to is awards. And we did that. We did that shamelessly when I was at PCI too. We did have an award for the shows that CDC actually made the judging, and then we had a luncheon and we gave out the awards. If there were, the university had a way of setting up screenings and so on, and then they recognized really important achievements by the creative community, that would be a very interesting connection to make, and people would begin to identify this community with their concerns, and there would be a natural kind of connection being built up right there. That's a long-range thing you're going to mull over, but just remember, we're award addicts in the show business. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Is there anything further that anybody wants to say from?
Just that we hope you'll all stay engaged, and I believe there's a list outside if you haven't signed up already, but we do have all your names, so feel free to, if you didn't sign up, shoot us an email and let us, oh, here it is.
If anyone didn't get this, do you mind signing up before you leave?
So we'll be in touch and let you know our next steps, and we'll likely have a brief summary from what was discussed at the event, as well as about 20 interviews that we did before the event to titrate down learnings. And I think with that.
Okay, and I think perhaps you might want to express your expression to this remarkable panel.
Yes.
Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you. And by the way, I was warned that you would never stay for 3 hours, and you did. Thank you.